reflection of a wider debate raging in Britain. Black Lives Matter supporters arguing with opponents by the statue of Winston Churchill opposite the UK Parliament. It was boarded up because of fears it could be targeted by protesters. Now the Prime Minister's called the need to protect monuments absurd and insisted people should not be protesting.
What's happened with these demonstrations is that a tiny minority, or actually a growing minority unfortunately, have hijacked them, and they are using them as a pretext to attack the police, to cause violence and to cause damage to public property. So unfortunately my message to everybody is that for all sorts of reasons they should not go to these demonstrations.
Last weekend, demonstrators in the city of Bristol pulled down a statue of 17th century slaver Edward Colston. It's now been retrieved from the river and will be housed in a museum. Some commentators have suggested Britain should leave such monuments up as a reminder of the evils of the past. The local mayor disagrees.
Statues in and of themselves do not do the job of teaching us history. If you were to try and base your historical knowledge of Bristol on a statue of Colston and you were using that to write an A-level paper, I'd give you an E, because it tells you he was a wise and virtuous son of the city. But that's not the full story, is it?
And at the latest anti-racism protests in central London, there was little sympathy for Boris Johnson's stance.
I'm not sort of for going around and ripping down statues, but I think, people need to ask themselves really serious questions about who we hold up as standard bearers. Some parts people in Munich might want to have a statue of Adolf Hitler.
Whatever people do, there's always someone complaining about how we're trying to get a message across. So we protest, and I feel like that's one of the best ways to get a message across, because no one wants to listen to us. There's so many things wrong and people are just ignoring it.
These protests have given people a chance to air grievances about perceived police brutality and discrimination in Britain right now, but they've also opened up a debate about how the country remembers its past and who it chooses to celebrate. The protesters say it's about opening up difficult discussions, not just closing down symbols of oppression. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera, London.
A bomb has ripped through a crowd of worshippers at a mosque in Kabul. At least 5 people are dead, including the imam who was leading Friday prayers. Filio Kantrafuri reports in the Afghan capital.
The Shah Suri Mosque was packed with worshippers for Friday prayers when an explosion ripped through it, killing several people. According to the Afghan Ministry of Interior, the explosives were placed inside the mosque. Some witnesses say they tried to help the injured.
When I entered the mosque, I saw all the injured people. The imam was killed on the spot. We started to carry the dead bodies as well as the injured. And then they didn't allow us to go inside the mosque.
The Taliban has denied responsibility for the attack. The explosion comes days after another mosque in Kabul was targeted. The imam was killed and ISIL claimed responsibility. The government and Afghans alike have condemned the attacks on these places of worship.
This is how the terrorists are prolonging and targeting holy places like mosques. We condemn this attack, and it's against any rule of fighting.
The attack happened at a critical moment for Afghanistan. Peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government are closer than ever, with some saying they'll start within weeks. And as attacks on places of worship increase, so is the concern that spoilers like ISIL could try to undermine the political process. Everyone involved in the negotiation says they must be prevented from doing so. Filio Kontrafuri, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Here with the News Hour. Still ahead, how mosquito saliva could save millions of lives. One woman's search for her birth parents leads to a landmark court ruling that could help thousands of adoptees. Coming up in sport, we'll tell you how Premier League footballers are planning on supporting Black Lives Matter. Details coming up.
Hello there. Still very warm across eastern areas of Europe, but really through central regions and out towards the west, it has been about the rain. This system across the west has just been sitting in the Bay of Biscay and producing some torrential downpours. Look at this. This is what it did across into the capital of Corsica. You can see this floodwater just raging down the streets. These really were flash floods, but of course it did, once it had subsided, still leave, as you can see, many cars underwater. Nobody was injured, but there has been a lot of damage. But then across into Eastern Europe, it's a very different story. It's been about the heat. It's been dry. Temperatures in Moscow have been about 7 or 8 degrees above the average. So people obviously out and about doing what they can to actually stay cool. Now, it is going to cool off into Western Russia. In fact, look at that. By Saturday, the rain comes in, the cloud, just 17 degrees in Moscow. But it's a very unsettled picture. Much of Eastern Europe, some fairly severe thunderstorms. And in particular, Eastern France, yet again, more very heavy rain. It'll trail down across into Corsica. We could have some more flooding. And then by Sunday, that system does clear away from France. Still some showers. It's a very showery pattern across the UK and Ireland, even northern Spain and Portugal. But the really heavy rain, that will be across areas of Germany and further to the south. But it's a warm day in Berlin, 28 degrees Celsius before the cloud and the rain arrives, and beginning to improve in London and Paris. As you can see, their temperatures generally in the low 20s.
The glamour of Bollywood in an unlikely place.
Morocco, it's another Indian country.
I think I inherited it from my mother. She was very impressed with Indian faces.
There's a lot of love and affection and respect with the Moroccan people.
A world away from Mumbai, a nation has taken Indian cinema to its heart. Al Jazeera World reveals the colour and passion of Morocco's Bollywood dream.
Al Jazeera, wherever you are.
The whole stadium's air conditioned right up through the seats down to the pitch.
Hello again, the top stories on the Al Jazeera News Hour. India has reported a record daily increase of coronavirus cases, making it the world's fourth worst hit country. With cases almost hitting 300,000, the government is easing restrictions, even though hospitals appear to be under strain. Libya's national oil company says it's lost more than $5 billion since January. That's because of the ongoing fighting. Libya's oil field is close to the latest battles between the UN-backed government and fighters loyal to warlord Khalifa Haftar. The governor of the U.S. state of New York has signed a package of sweeping police reform bills in response to the nationwide police brutality protests. Andrew Cuomo says the reforms are the most aggressive in the nation and will hold police more accountable. Now, as he made an urgent appeal for almost $200 million, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees told Al Jazeera a perfect storm of terrorism, climate change, and a host of other factors is creating a dire situation for displaced people in the Sahel. Many are fleeing violence in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Nicholas Haag reports.
Hiding under the staircase of an abandoned school is the Boli family, shaken from an attack. They've turned classroom benches into beds. Beneath is everything they saved before Dogon militia armed with machetes and guns tore through their village in central Mali. 66-year-old Abdoulaye Boli has seen a lot of conflict between Fulanis and Dogon in his lifetime, but the brutality of this week's attack has left him in shock.
I am afraid of the Dogon militias, not the jihadi groups or Malian forces. They don't harm us like them, but they don't protect us either. The militias control our movements, they kill us and burn our villages.
A UN investigation accuses Dogon militias and the militaries in the Sahel of committing more acts of extrajudicial killings on the civilians they are meant to protect than the armed groups they're fighting.
no individual has been sanctioned and held responsible for all those violations. So that has generated a general sense of impunity in the Sahel and a repetition of this abuse.
2.3 million people, mostly children, are on the move fleeing the violence in the Sahel. 5 million are facing hunger and are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. The United Nations Refugee Agency says they are overstretched.
It's a combination of factors all coming together. Poverty, lack of investments in development for years, climate change, the action of armed groups, of terrorist insurgency, weak governments. All of this is coming together now.
What started off as an armed insurgency in northern Mali in 2013 has now spread beyond the Sahel into Togo and Ivory Coast, with attacks being carried out by groups linked to Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Last Friday, while tens of thousands of Malians demonstrated against their government's inability to protect people from the violence, French forces said they'd killed the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Abdelmalik Dugdal, in northern Mali. The announcement comes as the United Nations wants to slash the $1 billion budget of the UN peacekeeping operation in Mali for failing to deliver peace. The mandate of the 14,000 troop is up for renewal while the United Nations Security Council debates the future of the mission. Abdoulaye Bouli and his family wonder not when, but if they will be able to return home. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera.
Well, returning to the coronavirus, and the pandemic has been particularly devastating for indigenous people across Latin America. Hundreds of tribes across the continent are difficult to access or test for the disease, but some are fighting back. So communities living deep in Brazil's Amazon rainforest have blocked access to their villages. Despite this, rights groups say they are still twice as likely to die from the virus than other Brazilians. In Mexico, the indigenous population of more than 12 million often use community radio to share information in remote areas. Ecuador's Cayambe population of 80,000 are guarding the entrance to their town. They have just one infection. And in Colombia's cloud forests, 10,000 members of the Ua tribe have also set up guard posts. Teresa Bo reports on why doctors fear the virus will devastate indigenous communities in Brazil.
More than 900,000 people from more than 300 tribes. These are members of Brazil's indigenous communities. Coronavirus is spreading fast among them, and now they're struggling to cope with disease.
They had a specific ward for indigenous people, for shamans, for us to perform our rituals and our medicines, but there's nothing like that here. We have to go through other hospitals for a referral. When you get there, they don't put on the documents that we're indigenous.
This hospital in Manaus has a designated area for treating indigenous patients, but doctors say the biggest problem is not here.
The disease is spreading into the interior, and now it's going to hit the municipalities, the river communities, and the indigenous. In the case of indigenous people, they'll be brought here. And why do we have an indigenous ward? Because we need to learn to treat people that are differently, and to value what's ours, what's from the Amazon. We're the state with the highest concentration of indigenous in Brazil, the highest concentrations of indigenous in the world.
NGOs say the death toll among indigenous people in Brazil rose from 28 to nearly 200 in just 1 month, and they expect the number to rise. We spoke to Sonia Guajajara, who is in the city of Imperatriz, deep in Amazonia. She says many communities are fearing extermination.
There is an increase in illegal miners and loggers, and they bring in the risk of infection. We don't have the privilege to care for the pandemic alone. We have to do this and at the same time keep on fighting with historical problems we face that were never resolved, like deforestation and invaders in our territory.
Deforestation has also increased in the past months compared to previous years. Illegal miners and loggers are pushing deeper into the jungle. Brazil's president has made it clear he wants to open up the rainforest for business, and the discourse is an incentive to those who want to expand Brazil's agricultural frontier. A video released by the Supreme Court during an investigation against the president shows his environment minister expressing the government's plans.
We need to make an effort while we are in this calm moment in terms of press coverage, because they are only talking about COVID, and push through and change all the rules and simplify norms.
Environmental groups say the government wants to move forward with a legislative agenda that will weaken safeguards against the incursion on indigenous lands. And for these communities, it means their livelihood is seriously at risk, threatened not only by a pandemic that continues to spread, but also by a government that is ignoring their calls for help. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera.
So can we trust coronavirus statistics given the variation in testing numbers and criteria around the world? As early as February, Chinese officials changed their criteria when they chose to include clinically diagnosed infections because of a shortage of tests. New cases surged by 1,500 in just a day. In April, Spain's prime minister was criticized for claiming a study ranked their testing volume 5th in the world. The only problem was no such study existed. Many in the UK are skeptical of the government's daily testing count. The number includes tests that have only been posted out, and mouth and throat swabs are counted twice. And the Chilean government caused outrage when it confirmed the number of coronavirus patients who had died were being included in the number of recorded recoveries. Let's talk about this with John Byrne-Murdoch, a data journalist at the Financial Times here in London. Thanks for your time with us. And I know this is something that you look into quite deeply. So given the variation of testing numbers and differing government policies, can we actually trust the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, as you've just alluded to in your introduction there is more and more evidence now that we really do need to be very skeptical of the numbers that we're hearing directly from governments. And that, as you suggested there, has been true all over the world. We also had some reporting ourselves, colleagues of mine from India, specifically from New Delhi this week, showing that there as well, this is